Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the lecture. This part is going to start with another definition of terms, and this is about writing back. This is the final thing that you'll need to think about theoretically this week, and very useful, I think, for thinking about the text this week. So writing back is an idea which comes from a term coined by Salman Rushdie in 1982. He wrote an article for the Times newspaper called "The Empire Writes Back with a Vengeance." And this idea was picked up upon by literary critics. Of course, it's a pun on The Empire Strikes Back, the film of the early 1980s. But that punningness was thought to be quite interesting, quite humorous for dealing with a very serious theme, which was about post-colonialism. And a team of 3 literary critics, Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths and Helen Tiffin, put together a collection of articles, of chapters called "The Empire Writes Back" in 1989, which was really the first well-known critical work on post-colonial writing. So they took Rushdie's idea and they turned it into a book which was about examples of post-colonial writing, either people from the colonial context or people who were looking at that colonial context and looking back at it, and thinking about the ways in which the empire was writing back to that imperial centre, was answering back, was developing its own literatures, its own genres, and was exploring the themes of colonialism, of oppression, of racism, and so on. That original post-colonial context was then transferred to other scenarios, and that's one of the ways I think it's useful to us this week. So writers often, in the imperial writing back genre, they often retell a canonical story from the imperial past, and they reinsert the voices that were written out. I think you can see how that's useful for thinking about Itutuba and Weird Sister. So Jean Rhys's book, Wide Sargasso Sea from 1966, is about the first Mrs. Rochester in Jane Eyre, the character who is shut up in the attic in Jane Eyre. Or Sally Bowman's book, Rebecca's Tale from 2001, is about the first Mrs. De Winter. And these tell the stories of those women who are silenced in the original texts, or who are only allowed to speak in ways which make them seem exotic, make them seem repellent, make them seem dangerous, and indeed in some cases even witchy. That reinsertion of voices lends itself very well to contemporary fictions about witches who either get to tell their own story or who return in some way as revenants, as ghosts, as presences that we can't quite explain, to wreak vengeance on those who have oppressed them. It's a form of writing back. It's not the post-colonial form of writing back, but it comes from that post-colonial context. I want to think about Atwood in this section as well, and I want to think about the way that she rewrites something. What she does is writing back in quite a classic sense. She actually takes the words of Mary Webster, her half-hanged Mary, in the poem Half-Hanged Mary, and she uses that voice to write back to those who have oppressed women, she argues, since the 17th century at least. And she does this in Morning in the Burned House in 1995, so she's looking back a very long time, but she's also saying this kind of historical oppression is very relevant to today, and we ought to listen to Mary Webster's voice, and here I am going to ventriloquise it for her. This form of writing back she describes in the following way. She says, "Some days my grandmother would say that we were related to her, to Mary Webster, or on other days she would deny the whole thing because it wasn't very respectable. I was actually trying to write a novel about her, but unfortunately I didn't know enough about the late 17th century to be able to do it. But I did write a long narrative poem called Half-Hanged Mary because she only got half-hanged." And that's from an interview in 2017 when she's thinking back some time again to her writing of the poem Half-Hanged Mary. So what she'd like to do, in a sense, is write a classic realist novel, but she doesn't know enough and she doesn't feel it's convincing enough, and also she wants to say something else. So she wants to speak in this woman's voice, and perhaps she wants to speak in the ways that the poem does. Think back to part 1 of the lecture. How far is Half-Hanged Mary, for example, postmodernist? How far is it magical realism? It's certainly got some of the features that we talked about in that section of the lecture. Discontinuity, for example, disorientation of the reader, things like that. Language disintegrates in the course of the poem in ways which really sound very postmodernist. A realist novel might not have behaved in the same way. So she thinks about genre, and she thinks about writing back in a different genre, a shorter poetic genre, to tell the story of Mary Webster. What can we say about the poem? Is it magical realist? Is it postmodern? Is it writing back? Think about some of the ingredients that I've suggested might go into that brew, if you like, so far. It has some magic in it, possibly. Mary certainly seems to acquire a kind of magic during the course of her hanging and her survival. But on the other hand, we're not entirely certain how far is this, for example, delusional, or how far is it not real magic, as it were, but sort of a function of the linguistic confusion that she descends into. Is it about her own empowerment? Is that magical? And it appears to be a form of empowerment that comes with a kind of madness that afflicts her as a result of this terrible experience that's happened to her. Her survival doesn't seem to be quite magical, but on the other hand, maybe it has magical attributes to it. It's not historically accurate. She wasn't half hanged. She was supposedly hanged up and then thrown down in the snow by the people who were abusing her in Hadley, the Massachusetts village where she lived in the 17th century. So what Atwood does is take an historical occurrence of violence against an accused witch and turn it into something which is more magical, that a woman is hanged overnight and left to die, but manages miraculously to survive. So think about, is it magical realist? What's going on here? How much magic is there? It's reclaiming a story, certainly, as I suggested. So Mary Webster is a real historical individual. She's supposedly Atwood's ancestor, maybe not. That story is reclaimed, and it's told in the voice of the witch herself. That sounds very much like writing back, doesn't it? It offers a challenge to syntax and grammar and rhyme and metre and to canonical conventions. So it slips into various kinds of not particularly literary sorts of writing. There's humour, which perhaps we don't expect in this context. Again, that sort of disorientates the reader a little bit, doesn't it? It makes us uncomfortable. There are colloquialisms. It sounds like this woman is chatting to us as she hangs from the tree. It's a very accessible poem, and its shortness is part of that. So there are all sorts of features about it which recall the three kinds of literary theoretical category that I've been talking about. And you might want to use this as an example for thinking through how those work in practice with a text. Let's move on also to thinking about Maryse Condé and her novel I, Tituba in this context. We can see some of the same features, I think, in Condé's novel that we can see in Atwood's poem. But one of the things that Condé does in interviews about Tituba is push things a little bit further. So she speaks specifically about the historical Tituba, and she starts to pick away at the idea of writing back. She says, for me, Tituba is not a historical novel. Tituba is just the opposite of an historical novel. Interesting to think about what that opposite might be. What is that exactly? I was not interested at all in what her real life could have been. I had few precise documents. Her deposition testimony, that's the only one that she mentions here. It forms the only historical part of the novel, and she does indeed reproduce it in the course of the novel. And I was not interested in getting anything more than that. I really invented Tituba, she says. I hesitated, she says later on in another discussion point in the interview, between irony and a desire to be serious. The result is that she is a sort of mock epic character. So that's interesting, isn't it? She speaks about the injustices against women, particularly black women in this case, with passion, but yet she also retreats from that passion, and she goes rather more towards the kind of terms that we've seen associated with postmodernism earlier on in the lecture, a sort of playfulness, a sort of refusal to commit, a sort of reduplicativeness, a sort of metafictional reflection on a text where she's thinking about it not as being history, not as being serious, but as being a playful engagement with something that maybe once happened in the past but is now up for redevelopment, is up for revisiting generically. She moves away from the idea that it's a straightforward historical text. She moves away from realism, and she moves towards the idea of a sort of playful identity for her character. And that's kind of uncomfortable in some ways. If you're expecting a historical novel, if you're expecting a rewrite of a character, if you're expecting a rewriting from the point of view of writing back, maybe you get that, maybe you don't. It's certainly not the character coming back to say, I was horribly abused, this was terrible, the people who abused me were terrible. That is perhaps the import of the story overall, but there's a playfulness, there's a lack of seriousness here, which is very interesting and really does move the novel towards a definition of postmodernism, I think. Condé goes on to talk about this. She says, the question of grandmothers telling stories and thus teaching their granddaughters to become writers is one of the biggest cliches of black female writing. I repeat, the element of parody is very important if you wish to fully comprehend Tituba. If one misses the parody in Tituba, one will not understand, for example, why she meets Hester Prynne in jail and why they discuss feminism in modern terms. Similarly, the presence of the invisible, the conversations with the mother and with Mama Yaya, is deliberately overdrawn. Do not take Tituba too seriously, please. So she introduces Hester Prynne. If you've read Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel The Scarlet Letter, you know that Hester Prynne is a character in that novel. She's not a real historical individual. She's Hawthorne's invention. So Condé's Tituba, a real historical individual, but of course substantially rewritten, meets Hester Prynne, a character from another fiction. There's that element of metafiction, intertextuality going on. And they converse and they talk in very modern terms about feminism. And Condé wants us to notice that. So she makes it very obvious that she's playing a game with us, that she's getting us to think about the ideas that they're discussing. She does not want us to be immersed in the story. She wants to lift us out of the story and force us to think about what's being discussed in it. So here are some interesting differences from some of the other texts that we've looked at. This isn't quite like what Stella Benson is doing in her story. It isn't quite like what Atwood is doing in her poem. I, Tituba has a voice all of its own, but it very much moves in the same kind of territory of those three definitions of literary terms that I've talked about. It has magical realist elements, it has postmodernist elements, and it has elements of writing back as well. So move on to the exercise for part 2 of the lecture and think about some of the things that Condé has said, particularly here with regard to humour. So looping back to our original discussion in the first lecture and the first classes of the role of humour in discussing the crime of witchcraft and the terrible punishments inflicted on people for it. Think about how humour, parody, flippancy, joke, irony, those sort of things in the text that we're studying this week help us think about the issues that they present. And here they are hugely serious issues, aren't they? There is racism, there is misogyny, there is violence of all sorts, there's persecution, injustice. People are murdered for being who they are, people are raped, people are treated with unbelievable cruelty, people are enslaved. Yet there is an element of lightness in the text, there's a playfulness, there's a humour. And that can be uncomfortable sometimes, and I think Condé wants that. I think she wants us to feel uncomfortable. So find an example of humour that you find makes you feel uneasy, and think about why that is, and comment on that in the modular discussion forum. Also think about ambiguity as well. This has been a very ambiguous discussion so far. These terms evade us, these terms play with us. How does ambiguity work to enhance the impact of the novels that we're looking at this week? You know, in Weird Sister, who or what is Agnes? We'll come on to Weird Sister further in the final part of the lecture. What about I, Tituba? What are the statuses of characters like Abina, her mother, who apparently returns in some form of spirit form to Tituba? What about Mama Yaya? Who are these characters? What evidence is presented to us to help us judge who they are? Why are the texts so ambiguous, and what role does ambiguity play in getting us to think through the serious substantive issues that the texts present to us?